ritual I find myself periodically performing at this point in my life and career is what I call the purging of the books. I am a book hoarder. I have books on my shelves that go back to when I was in seminary to ones that I purchased last week. You reach a point where you just can't accommodate them all. So in conducting this ritual, I apply a law which I call the 10-year rule. If I haven't opened a book in the last 10 years, and if there's a reasonably good chance I will not open it 10 years from now, and that's assuming I'm still opening books in 10 years, then off the shelf it goes, and hopefully somewhere someone who can put it to better use than I will. Well, so far, at least 2 long-held books of mine have escaped the 10-year rule. Each one has a chapter that offers point and counterpoint positions on the subject of guilt. And a brief quote from each one of them is at the top of your order of service for today. The first one is by Dr. Wayne Dyer in his book, Your Erroneous Zones. That sounds like a very 70s kind of a book, which makes sense because that's when it came out, but it's still not completely dated. In a chapter dealing with guilt, Dyer writes, "Guilt is the most useless of all erroneous zone behavior. It is by far the greatest waste of emotional energy, as it leaves you feeling immobilized in the present over something that has already taken place and that no amount of guilt can change." All right, hold that thought. There's a counter-argument to Dyer in a book titled Feelings. The author of this one is a psychiatrist and an ethicist named Dr. Willard Galen, G-A-Y-L-I-N, Dr. Willard Galen. In his chapter on guilt, Galen goes right at Dyer with these words. "The failure to feel guilt is the basic flaw in the psychopath or antisocial person. Guilt is not a useless emotion. It is this emotion that signals us when we have transgressed from codes of behavior we personally want to sustain. Feeling guilty informs us that we have failed our own ideals. Guilt is the guardian of our goodness." Well, as is frequently the case in these kinds of point-counterpoint arguments, there is some truth to be found on each side. So we're going to use these 2 writers as points of departure, see what kind of truths we might tease out from each one of them, and this gets us to story time. In a much earlier chapter of my minister life, I had just moved to the town of Stevens Point, Wisconsin, to be the Protestant Interfaith Campus Minister at the University of Wisconsin branch there. I was single, I was in my late 20s, that's how long ago it was, and I got myself this neat bachelor apartment. I decided the thing that would make it even neater would be to get a good stereo system. So I drove down to the big city of Madison, where I linked up with a couple of my more techno-savvy friends who helped me with my purchase. It was the first time in my life I had ever spent any really significant amount of money on anything strictly for my own pleasure. I got me a good set of these great big speakers. In those days, the bigger the speakers, the better the sound. And I got a big old receiver with an AM/FM radio on it and a state-of-the-art turntable. Anybody remember turntables? Yeah. You put these thin black discs called albums on them, and they play this really cool music through your great big speakers. Well, I guess I paid somewhere between $400 and $500 for the whole works, which in the mid-70s is a considerably bigger chunk of change than it is even now. And I felt pretty good about the whole thing. Until when, alone in my car, I made a 2-hour drive back from Madison up to Stevens Point. And I got this strange feeling that I'd done something vaguely wrong. All this nice new stuff that I'd loaded into my car was giving me vague feelings of guilt. And I knew where they came from. As I mentioned before, I was raised in a home, a safe and loving one, to be sure, but one where we nearly always lived right on the economic edge. We always had good food to eat and decent clothes to wear, secure roof over our heads, my mom, dad, 3 sisters, and I. But at times it wasn't much more than that. My father struggled to raise his family as a self-employed house painter. For him, living from paycheck to paycheck would have been a luxury. He lived from job to job. And the clear message in this setting was, you don't spend money on frivolous things, because even when you have it, you're going to need it for more important and necessary things when the money runs low again. And all I could think of as I drove through the Wisconsin night was that I had spent more money on all this fancy stereo equipment than my father sometimes made in a month or so when I was a kid. How can I go throwing money around like that in the way I just did, in such a self-indulgent way? The feelings, of course, were completely irrational. I was earning enough to allow for an occasional expenditure of this kind. I was only supporting myself. I wasn't taking money away from any kind of family needs. But somewhere inside me came an unsettling message. You shouldn't have done this. You're supposed to live within certain means that do not permit this kind of indulgence. It was an old tape, but it still played. It came from the way I had to live, and from a mindset I had to maintain when I was growing up. The guilt, you see, had nothing at all to do with what I had done. It had everything to do instead about the messages I was still giving myself. Well, I'm pleased to report the guilt tape didn't play too long. Once I got everything set up and running and listened to a few of those albums, the guilt soon went away, but it did have me going for at least a while. You may not be responsible for where your blaming messages come from or how you got them. The experiences from my family of origin are part of the hard drive of my life. I am blessed in that most of those experiences are positive. But however positive or negative they may be, you are responsible for what you do with the messages you take away from your personal story and how much power you still give them over you. And once I got myself straight on that score, I was fine, and the music played on. Well, as noted, if Dr. Dyer could hear this story, he would offer it as a classic case of unnecessary or neurotic or useless guilt. And he would be absolutely right. So that gives Dyer his due. We're going to give Dr. Galen his turn now with another story. And this one isn't mine, but it took place during a pretty formative period of my life. A time I remember very, very well. It's about a woman named Catherine Power. She was a student at Brandeis University in the late 1960s, the same time that I was in graduate theological school. Miss Power was bright and young and impressionable, and she got caught up in the near-apocalyptic intensity of the anti-Vietnam War movement. Miss Power and I are about the same age. The reason her story was so captivating for me and remains so captivating for me is because I can recall being caught up in some of the same emotions, some of the same passions as she was at that time. Like many others of my age in that era, though, I did draw a hard and fast line at nonviolence, which was a line not to be crossed. Ms. Power's escalating involvement in the anti-war movement, however, took her out to a fringe where very few of us went. In her case, it went clear out to her involvement in an armed bank robbery in the Boston area, supposedly to get money for the cause. Ms. Power did not take place in the robbery itself. She was about a half a block away, driving a getaway car. In the course of the robbery, very horrifically and tragically and senselessly, a Boston police officer was shot and killed by the two men with whom Ms. Power was alive. She didn't know a murder had been committed until they were driving away, but she was charged as an accomplice since she helped the two guys escape. The three of them became fugitives. The two men who did the killing were caught and jailed and later died in prison. Ms. Power, however, managed to stay hidden as a fugitive. She got herself a new identity and lived a reconstituted life, which came to include a husband, a son, and a job in Corvallis, Oregon. Nearly 25 years of her fugitive life went by, with her son becoming a teenager, before Miss Power came forth, returned to Boston, and turned herself in after making arrangements with her attorney to do so. She served 6 years in jail of a 12-year jail sentence before being paroled. And her case later became the basis for a Law and Order TV episode. So why did she come in? After 2 decades, more than 2 decades, 2.5 decades, of successfully hiding out. Well, part of it was her desire to be reunited with her aging parents before they died. She had to cut off all contact with them in order to remain hidden. But a big part of it, according both to Miss Power and her therapist, had to do with guilt. However skillful she had been at hiding from the powers of law enforcement, Miss Power could not hide from herself and from her knowledge of her role in a police officer's death. So intense was her guilt that it resulted in a clinical depression. Miss Power was living free and unfree all at the same time. She eventually had to face the choices she'd made, choices made, to be sure, in the heat of a frenzied time and with less than a clear head, but choices for which she was responsible nonetheless. Her prison term was part of a personal reconciliation process for her. She even turned down an offer of an earlier parole date than the one she finally accepted. Okay, I know there is a vast middle ground between momentary guilt feelings over purchasing a stereo system and being an accomplice to murder. And most of the guilt issues we find ourselves dealing with are generally somewhere in that vast middle ground. If we look then at Dr. Galen's treatment of the subject, we can get some guidance perhaps on how to sort out the useless from the far from useless guilt. In the book I mentioned earlier, Feelings, Dr. Galen treats a wide range of human emotions and feelings as survival mechanisms, which he maintains we human beings have developed over the course of human history. And he structures his book so he devotes one chapter to each of these survival mechanisms, one of those chapters having to do with guilt. Now, the evolutionary origins of guilt, as Dr. Galen claims, and with which I agree, is that it's a human emotion or an internal mechanism which we human beings developed over the course of our evolution for the sake of our survival and for the continuance of the human race. At some point in our human evolution, we developed a conscience. That is to say, some internal mechanism for both keeping ourselves in check and for feeling some responsibility for the safety and well-being of others. So hand in hand with this evolution of conscience, still staying with Galen's case here, came an awareness of our human ability and capacity to inflict hurt and great harm to one another. And something in our developing human psyche recoiled in fear at such a tendency. Now, we human beings, very tragically, we've not stopped inflicting harm upon one another due to fear, among many other things. But we can't quite accept it either. Or we can only accept the harm we do to others up to a point. I'm going to get biblical for a moment or two here. I'll go from Galen's psychological take on these things to the Bible. For I feel there are parts of the Bible that are helpful and enlightening for religious liberals, if read in a way that gets beyond literalism. Recall the story in the book of Genesis about the brothers Cain and Abel. Cain kills Abel in a dispute. He then hears the voice of God asking him where Abel is. He responds to God with a question. Am I my brother's keeper? There is, of course, no literal or historical basis for this story. It's a myth. But it is still instructive as a mythological rendition of that very real and prolonged period in human evolution, when we human beings began to realize what we're capable of doing to one another. was then that we first began asking questions, albeit in a very primitive mode at first, about who we are and about what our relationships and responsibilities to one another are. Am I my brother or sister's keeper? And it was in response to this dawning awareness that we humans devised laws and codes of behavior and morals and ethics. We did this both to protect ourselves from our baser selves, as well as to call us to our better selves. So Galen is quite right, therefore, in maintaining that there is a rational basis for guilt that serves human good. Just as he is right when he says, the failure to feel guilt is the basic flaw in the psychopath. Well, for me, taking all of that, it finally comes down to a pretty simple bit of self-inventory and a pretty simple question, even if the answers get complicated at times. It's a question of, what is it that I could and should rightfully regret when it comes to how I've treated others, or how my acts and words have been harmful or had a hurtful effect on others, and for which I bear responsibility? And how do I deal with that? Now, anything else, anything that's not on that list, however, and which I still may be feeling guilty about, probably does constitute a case of useless guilt. Well, I got one more direction to go with this topic this morning. And it has to do with how religion and guilt often get all mixed in together. One remark I often hear from persons who are attracted to Unitarian Universalism is that, well, I really love it here because you don't have all that guilt. Yeah. And this is generally said by persons who were raised in a religious environment where they were practically made to feel guilty for their very existence. And that, in essence, is what the doctrine of original sin teaches, by the way. That you're guilty just for showing up. That has to be the ultimate irrational guilt. But if we dig a little deeper, we can also find this kind of rational, irrational guilt dynamic in the religious realm as well as some of the other places I've been talking about. For all the horrible ways in which religion can be abused and perverted, one of the positive purposes of religion is to offer a set of values and principles that will hopefully enable us to live good and moral and ethical lives, and to assume some responsibility for our well-being, as well as the well-being of others. You can do all that without being a religious person, certainly, but I think that's one of the purposes of religion. In the most positive sense, we have religion in order to call us to our better selves, as well as remind us when we have fallen short of the values and the principles we attempt to live by. For example, this is what the Jewish New Year observance of Yom Kippur is all about. You take an inventory at this time of year. You take an inventory of your possible misdeeds and seek to make amends so you can start the new year with a fresh slate. Yom Kippur, as I'm sure many of you know, means Day of Atonement. And you don't have to be Jewish, of course, to need your occasional Day of Atonement, or to cleanse your soul now and then. That 6-year jail sentence Catherine Power served, for example, was her act of atonement for her role in a police officer's death. Now, the problem with Orthodox Christianity, as I came to see it somewhere along the line of my religious journey, was that it took this perfectly sound principle of atonement and drove it right over a cliff. Over a cliff with this doctrine of original sin, which is the idea that we're all born into a hopelessly fallen state from which we have to be redeemed by Jesus dying a horrible and excruciating death. We cannot atone for this fallen state ourselves, so this doctrine holds. So Jesus' death was his and God's act of atonement on our behalf. And we can only remove the guilt of our fallen state, so this doctrine goes, by acknowledging Jesus as our Savior. Well, there's a counter-argument to this orthodox position was set forth by one of the founding documents of our Unitarian Universalist faith tradition. The document is called A Treatise on Atonement, written clear back in 1803 by one of the founders of American Universalism, Hosea Ballou. Now, Ballou's argument was that Jesus' mission on earth was not to die to save us from an inherently fallen state, but to live and teach in such a way that would both call us to our better selves and remind us of when we fell short of that mark. Yes, we need from time to time to atone for our misdeeds, but that does not require an excruciating death to atone for a state of total depravity into which we were supposedly, but not really, born. This was Reverend Ballou's position, and I believe he was spot on over 200 years ago. I feel that religion has an ennobling role to play in human life. If I felt otherwise, I'd be in a different career. But it is a shallow and manipulative form of religion, of whatever variety, that relies on guilt to keep its followers loyal. I mean a guilt that says one is inadequate in the eyes of God if he or she does not specifically adhere to the letter of the law when it comes to certain beliefs, or to certain rules, practices, and personal but non-harmful behaviors. Well, to conclude, we've each been given a life that needs care and feeding and nurture, a life that needs respect and affirmation. It's a life that needs to be called to responsibility, to be sure, a life that needs its times of atonement, to be sure, but one that should not be burdened by unnecessary or irrational guilt. It's a life that must reach beyond the self and affirm and validate the worth and dignity and self-respect of others. A life that is accountable in some measure for the well-being of others. Keeping all this in balance is not always easy, but it's one of the essential tasks of being human. I feel that finding that balance between a healthy kind of self-fulfillment and a wider sense of responsibility beyond the nurture of oneself, that's one of the things it means to come down where one ought to be. That's what we're going to sing for our closing hymn. 'Tis a gift to be simple. We'll sing it through twice.